The hallway light hums with a low, dying frequency. Dust motes dance in the stagnant air, illuminated by a bulb that flickers in time with a heartbeat. The protagonist stands before the glass. His palm presses against the cold surface, leaving a faint smear of moisture on the frame. He reaches out, expecting the familiar mimicry of his own form. But the reflection stalls. It stays motionless while he moves, a hollow, empty vessel left behind for a fraction of a second. He holds his breath. The silence in the narrow space thickens, pressing against his ears like deep water. Then, with a sudden, violent jolt, the image snaps into alignment. The eyes in the glass lock onto his own, but the rhythm is wrong. He pulls his hand back, his knuckles white, his pulse thumping in his throat. The reflection remains fixed, staring back with an intensity that does not belong to him. He tries to turn away, but the movement feels sluggish, as if the air around him has turned to liquid. The boundary between the man and the image has frayed. Something has shifted in the glass, and it is not following his lead anymore. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped onto the pavement. The city streets stretched out in both directions, perfectly clean and utterly deserted. No trash rolled in the gutters. No distant sirens wailed. The morning light hit the asphalt, revealing a surface so pristine it felt artificial. He walked to the center of the road, waiting for the rumble of an engine or the sound of a footfall, but the silence remained absolute. He tapped his boot against the concrete. The sound was sharp, brittle, and died the instant it left his heel. It did not echo. It simply vanished. He looked up at the windows of the surrounding buildings. Every shade was drawn, every glass pane opaque, reflecting nothing but the empty street. The air lacked the scent of exhaust or rain, smelling only of sterile, recycled oxygen. He walked another block, his stride measured, searching for any sign of life. A single leaf lay on the white curb, motionless, despite a breeze that should have carried it away. The isolation began to settle into his chest, a weight that grew heavier with every step. He was walking through a landscape that existed, yet refused to function. The city was not just quiet, it was suspended, waiting for a command that would never come. He spotted the bench 50 yards ahead. A woman sat perfectly still, her posture rigid, hands resting flat on her knees. As he drew closer, he noticed her gaze. It was fixed on a point in the middle distance, unblinking, as if she were waiting for an event that had already passed. He stopped, 3 feet away, his own shadow stretching toward her feet. "Excuse me, can you tell me where the nearest station is?" The sound of his own voice felt intrusive in the heavy quiet. She did not turn her head. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice thin and devoid of inflection. "The tide rises twice when the clock strikes 13. He blinked, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the words. It was not a riddle. It was a total collapse of context. He stepped closer, leaning in to catch her eye. "I am sorry. I just need directions." She looked through him, her eyes glassy and focused on the empty space behind his shoulder. She offered no further acknowledgement, her body remaining as immovable as the stone beneath her. The social boundary he expected to bridge had simply vanished, leaving him standing in the presence of someone who functioned in a language he could not parse. She turned her face toward him then, a slow, mechanical movement that lacked any organic grace. A smile spread across her lips, stretching wide, but her eyes remained static, cold, and entirely detached from the expression below them. It was a mask of pleasantness, applied to a hollow space. He watched the corners of her mouth twitch, a rhythmic pulsing that felt less like a human gesture and more like a glitch in the visual field. He waited for a blink, a shift in focus, or even a subtle narrowing of those glass-like pupils, but nothing changed. The smile remained fixed, unyielding, and profoundly unsettling. He backed away, his boots scuffing against the pristine pavement with a sound that tore through the quiet. He turned and began to walk, his pace accelerating with every stride. The silence followed him, no longer just an absence of noise, but a heavy, pressing force that seemed to lean against his back. His footsteps echoed, sharp and rhythmic, yet each impact sounded smaller, swallowed by the vast, unblinking atmosphere of the street. He did not look back. He knew that if he turned, the bench would be empty, and the smile would be waiting for him in the shadows of the next corner. The street led him toward a crumbling facade, a structure that looked as if it had been forgotten by time. He stopped before a door left partially ajar, the wood splintered and gray. A draft pulled at his sleeve, smelling of dust and stagnant air. He pushed the door open further. The hinges did not creak. They moved with a jarring, liquid silence. Inside, the hallway stretched into a darkness that seemed to swallow the light filtering from behind him. He stepped over the threshold, his boots landing on debris that crunched with the sound of breaking glass. He moved deeper, passing rooms that stood open like empty rib cages. In the center of a small, barren chamber, he stopped. The floor was covered in a thick layer of paper. Hundreds of photographs lay scattered, face up, across the floorboards. He knelt, his knees hitting the wood with a dull thud. He reached out, his hand hovering over a glossy edge. These were not random prints. He touched the surface of the nearest image. It was a picture of himself, taken from an angle that suggested he had been watched. He scanned the floor, his breathing shallow, as the realization set in that his own history was being laid out like evidence in a room he had never visited before. He picked up another print. It showed him standing on a pier he did not recognize, the horizon behind him a blurred, violent gray. He turned the paper over, searching for a date, a stamp, anything to anchor the moment in reality. There was nothing. As he held it, the dark ink of his silhouette began to bleed. The outlines of his shoulders softened, then dissolved into a smear of shadow. He rubbed his thumb against the paper, but the ink did not smudge. It simply ceased to exist, pulled into the fibers of the paper like water into sand. Panic surged through him. He reached for a third photo, then a fourth, scattering them in his haste. Every image held the same contradiction, a version of him he could not recall, living moments he had never experienced. He looked back at the first photo, the one he had dropped. It was gone. He scanned the floorboards, sweeping his hands across the wood, but the paper had vanished. The room remained, the dust remained, but the evidence of his presence was being erased in real time. He pressed his palms against his chest, feeling the frantic rhythm of his heart, and realized with a cold, absolute certainty that he was becoming a ghost in his own life. He scrambled to his feet, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He lunged for the door, his hand outstretched to grip the frame. But the hallway, which had been only paces away seconds ago, seemed to pull back. He ran, his boots hammered against the wood, a frantic, rhythmic beat that did not bring him closer to the exit. The walls appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting with a slow, sickening pulse. He stopped, chest heaving, and stared down the corridor. It had not just lengthened, it had distorted. The floor tilted at an impossible angle, and the ceiling seemed to sag toward him, narrowing his path to a sliver of gray light. He turned back to the room he had just vacated, but the door was gone. In its place was a solid, unbroken wall of peeling plaster. He pressed his palms against the surface, feeling the cold grit of the material. There was no seam, no handle, no way back. The geometry of the building had rewritten itself while his back was turned. He was no longer walking through a house. He was trapped inside a shifting mechanical throat. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone, as the walls began to slide past him in a silent, grinding motion. He stumbled forward, his fingers trailing along the wall for guidance. The plaster felt slick, like damp skin. He reached a door, desperate for a room number, a sign, anything to tell him where he stood. But the brass plaque was wrong. It bore no digits. Instead, it was etched with jagged, branching lines that seemed to writhe when he stared directly at them. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the marks remained. They were not letters, not numbers, but a visual static that defied his ability to focus. He moved to the next door. It held a different set of glyphs, equally alien, equally sharp. He tried to trace the shape of a curve, but the mark shifted under his touch, sliding across the metal like mercury. The familiar logic of the world had been stripped away, leaving only these silent, mocking icons. He was not just lost in a building. He was an outsider in a place that had never known a human tongue. The silence of the hallway deepened, pressing against his temples. He looked back the way he came, but the path was now lined with hundreds of doors, each marked with a different, incomprehensible cipher. He was trapped in a library of madness, where every signifier had been erased, leaving him utterly stranded in a world that refused to be read. He brought his wrist up, desperate to ground himself in the standard measure of seconds and minutes. The watch face was a tiny circular cage. The second hand was not ticking. It was vibrating. Then, with a sharp, metallic snap, it began to retreat. It swept backward, carving through the numbers with impossible speed. He pressed his thumb against the glass, trying to pin the needle in place, but the metal grew searing hot against his skin. He recoiled, his hand shaking. The watch did not stop. The minute hand joined the frantic scramble, spinning counterclockwise until the two pointers blurred into a single, dark smear of motion. The steady, rhythmic pulse of time had vanished. In its place was a chaotic, grinding whine, emanating from the gears beneath the casing. He pulled the strap loose and hurled the watch against the floor. It shattered, but the sound of ticking did not cease. It grew louder, echoing from the walls themselves. 1,000 clocks beating in dissonant reverse. He backed away, his breath hitching in his throat. The anchor was gone. The present was dissolving, dragging him back into a past that was rapidly unspooling. He was not just losing his way. He was being erased by the very flow of the seconds he could no longer control. He opened his mouth to speak his own name, a desperate attempt to claim his place in the world. The sound did not come. It was as if the word had been deleted from his internal lexicon. He tried again, focusing every ounce of his remaining will on the syllables. But they were already gone, slipping through his consciousness like dry sand through a clenched fist. He reached out to the wall, clawing at the peeling wallpaper, trying to find a surface to scratch his identity into. His fingernails tore through the paper, but there was no grit, no resistance, only a hollow space behind the structure. He stood back, his chest heaving, searching for the familiar shape of his own history. It was a blank slate. The faces of people he once knew, the landmarks of his life, the very core of his personality were dissolving into a gray, featureless fog. He looked down at his own body, expecting to see a man, but the edges of his vision were darkening. He was becoming a shadow, a temporary guest in a space that had no room for a person. Every attempt to grasp at who he was only accelerated the erosion. He was no longer a participant in this reality. He was a ghost, haunting the ruins of a life that was currently being overwritten by the silence. He stumbled into a room that felt smaller than the space it occupied. The air was stagnant, tasting of ozone and dust. In the dead center of the ceiling, a single, naked bulb hung from a frayed wire. It swung with a rhythmic, pendulum-like persistence. Every arc brought it closer to his face, and with every pass, the light emitted a low-frequency hum. It was a vibration that bypassed his ears, sinking deep into his skull until his teeth began to ache in their sockets. He reached up, pressing his palms hard against his ears, but the sound did not dampen. It was physical, a bone-deep tremor that rattled his ribs and blurred his vision. He tried to step away, but his legs felt heavy, as if the floor were drawing power from his very marrow. The light pulsed, flickering in sync with the agonizing drone. His jaw locked, his eyes watered, and the pressure built behind his forehead like a dam about to burst. There was no escape from the frequency. It was the only thing left in the world. He stood frozen, mouth slightly agape, absorbing the vibration until it felt like his own bones were humming in sympathy with the bulb. The room tightened around him, and the limit of his endurance was reached. The humming finally ceased, leaving behind a silence more deafening than the sound. He leaned against the wall, but his hands slipped. The surface felt oily, shifting under his touch. He looked up, and the world had betrayed its own physics. A chair in the corner cast a shadow, but the shadow was not tethered to the legs. It pooled on the floor like spilled ink, then began to stretch, reaching out with jagged, unnatural limbs toward his boots. He kicked at it, but his foot passed through the darkness as if it were nothing more than smoke. Beside the chair, a coat hook projected a shadow that detached itself from the wall, sliding across the plaster like a living thing. It crawled toward him, silent and hungry. He backed away, his heels catching on the uneven floorboards, but the shadows were everywhere now. They peeled away from the corners, from the doorframe, and from his own feet, creeping inward with a rhythmic, pulsing motion. He realized then that these were not mere silhouettes cast by light. They were segments of his own fractured psyche, breaking away to reclaim the space he once occupied. He pressed his palms against his eyes to shut out the sight, but the darkness followed him, a cold, creeping weight that began to settle deep within his chest. He pushed through the threshold, stepping not into another room, but into a thick, swirling gray vapor that erased the horizon. The air was cold and tasted of wet ash. He walked forward, his boots making no sound on the invisible ground. A figure emerged from the gloom ahead, standing perfectly still. He reached out, his voice raspy from disuse, and asked for the way out. The figure turned, its face a blur of indistinct features. It spoke a single sentence about the color of a forgotten winter, then dissolved into the mist like breath on glass. He lunged forward, fingers grasping at the spot where the person had stood, but he caught only damp, empty air. Panic flared. He turned, searching for a path, but another figure appeared to his left. He demanded an answer, a hint, anything to ground his reality. The figure tilted its head, offered a word that held no meaning, and stepped backward into the rising fog. It vanished before its feet even left the ground. He stood alone in the silence, the fog pressing against his skin, muffling his own heartbeat. Every interaction was a hollow promise. He called out again, but the mist swallowed his voice, reflecting nothing back but an aching, absolute emptiness that seemed to grow wider with every step he took. He stumbled into a narrow alcove, where a small, leather-bound book rested on a splintered shelf. His hands shook as he pried the cover open. The first line was clear, detailing a walk through a sun-drenched garden. He moved his eyes to the second line, and the words twisted. The garden became a tomb, then a void, then a memory of a house he had never seen. He blinked, but the page did not stabilize. The ink pulsed, sliding across the parchment to form new, jagged sentences that clawed at his focus. One paragraph claimed he was the architect of this place, while the very next sentence insisted he was a prisoner waiting for an execution that had already occurred. He traced the lines with his thumb, and the ink smeared like wet blood, staining his skin. The contradiction was not a mistake. It was a wall. He tried to reconcile the logic, but his mind refused to bridge the gap. Each time he read a word, it dissolved, replaced by a polar opposite that rendered his progress meaningless. He dropped the book, but it did not hit the floor. It hovered for a heartbeat, then disintegrated into fine, black dust. The truth was not hidden. It was being erased as fast as he could perceive it. He pushed open a heavy iron door and stepped into a vast, circular chamber. Every inch of the wall was covered in clocks. Grandfather clocks, pocket watches, digital timers, and brass instruments, all ticked in a chaotic, uncoordinated rhythm. The sound was not a steady beat, but a frantic, metallic rain that vibrated through the floorboards and into his soles. He moved to the center of the room, his head snapping toward each new sound. The clicking, whirring, and grinding of gears reached a fever pitch, a deafening swarm of mechanical noise that drowned out his own thoughts. He reached out to touch a pendulum, hoping to find a pattern, but the motion only caused the surrounding clocks to accelerate. The room became a blur of spinning hands and frantic, jagged movements. He pressed his palms against his ears, but the vibration was internal, rattling his teeth and blurring his vision. Every clock displayed a different time, mocking his need for order. There was no sequence, no beginning, and no end to the cycle. He spun in a circle, trapped in a shifting vortex of seconds and minutes that refused to align. The air in the room felt thin, charged with the static of 1,000 escaping moments, and he could no longer distinguish the sound of the clocks from the pulse of his own racing heart. The cacophony was a physical weight, pushing against his chest until his fingers brushed the brass casing of the largest clock. The contact was brief, a mere graze of skin against cold metal. Instantly, the sound vanished. The ticking, the whirring, the grinding gears, it all stopped as if the universe had been muted by a divine hand. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, thick, and pressurized. It crashed into the room like an incoming tide, squeezing his eardrums with a force that made him stagger backward. He opened his mouth to shout, to break the stillness, but no sound escaped his throat. The vibration of the world had been severed. He stood in the dead center of the room, listening for the rhythm of his own pulse, but there was nothing. Not a hum, not a breeze, not the friction of his own skin against his palms. The air felt stale, trapped in a vacuum where time had ceased its movement. He stared at the motionless hands of the clocks, waiting for a single tick to shatter the void. But the silence held, pressing against his temples, demanding he acknowledge that the noise had not been silenced, but erased entirely. He reached for the wall to steady his balance, his movements slow and deliberate, fearing that even a shift in his own weight might trigger a collapse of the space around him. He looked down, needing to anchor himself to something tangible. He expected to see the familiar calluses and skin, but his vision blurred at the edges. He raised his hands, bringing them into the dim light of the room. They were not solid. Through the center of his palms, he could see the faint outline of the floorboards beneath him. He flexed his fingers, watching the movement repeat with a ghostly, delayed rhythm. The skin looked like thin parchment, stretched so tight it had lost its opacity. He clenched his fists, but the sensation of impact was missing. His knuckles passed through each other like smoke through a grate. A tremor climbed up his wrists, and he watched his own veins pulse with a dull, failing luminescence. The reality of the room was leaking into him, or perhaps he was leaking into the void. He rubbed his palms together, frantic for the friction of life. But there was only a cold, frictionless glide. The horror was not that he was dying, but that he was becoming unfinished, a sketch being erased from the canvas of the world. He pressed his translucent fingers against his chest, feeling for a heartbeat, but his own form offered no resistance. He was becoming a ghost in his own story, a fading memory losing its tether to the physical plane. The player hit the pause button, desperate to break the connection. The screen froze, a static image of that single light bulb dangling from the ceiling. He pulled his hands away from the controller and stood up, walking toward the kitchen to pour a glass of water. The room was quiet, lit by the hum of the refrigerator, yet the image followed him. Every time he blinked, the swaying light bulb burned into his retinas, a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse. He stared at the water in the glass, watching the surface tension, but the low-frequency vibration of the game seemed to rattle his own teeth. He turned his head, hoping to look at the wall, but the shadow there appeared to detach itself for a split second before snapping back into place. The horror had not stayed on the monitor. It had crossed the threshold, seeping into the reality of his own home. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white, waiting for the afterimage to fade. It did not. The brain, starving for logic, tried to find a pattern in the chaos of his own kitchen, but the game had already rewritten his perception. The silence of his house felt exactly like the silence of the room he had just left. He was no longer playing the game. He was carrying it inside his own mind. The player returned to the screen, hunting for a missed clue or a hidden sequence. He clicked through every interaction, but the gaps remained. Each question led to a hollow silence. Every diary entry contradicted the last. He realized then that there was no grand revelation waiting behind the curtain. The game was not a puzzle to be solved. but a system designed to dismantle the observer. He looked at the paused image and understood that the boundary between the character's dissolution and his own perception had already vanished. He was no longer analyzing a story. He was participating in a loop of broken logic. He tried to force a narrative structure onto the chaos, but his mind only circled the same missing pieces. The search for a pattern was the trap itself. The more he reached for clarity, the deeper the game pulled him into its fragmented, unstable reality. He sat in the dark, watching the static, unable to distinguish the game's silence from the silence of his own room. There was no exit, no final answer, only the terrifying awareness that his own capacity to make sense of the world had been compromised by the game's architecture. He was not just watching the descent, he was part of the collapse. The screen went black. The power light blinked twice and then extinguished, leaving the room in a heavy, unnatural darkness. The player sat perfectly still, listening to the hum of the house, but the silence felt aggressive. He turned away from the monitor, yet the feeling of being watched remained, sharp and persistent. It was as if the gaze of the protagonist had peeled itself off the glass and was now fixed on the back of his neck. He stood up, his movements stiff, and walked toward the window to look out at the real world. The streetlights were steady, the pavement was solid, but he could not shake the image of the backward spinning watch. His mind kept reaching for the missing pieces of the story, circling the same contradictory memories, unable to find a point of rest. The game was over, yet the cycle continued. He closed his eyes, hoping for clarity, but saw only the swaying light bulb and the shadows detaching from the corners. There was no conclusion to be found. The story had not ended. It had simply become a permanent stain on his perception. Every time he glanced at the darkened screen, he expected to see a reflection that did not move in sync. He was trapped in the loop, a passenger to an unresolved, bleeding memory that refused to fade.